type of music, and that's how you worship God. But worship means attributing worth to somebody. And certainly that could be bowing down in worship or singing a song. Certainly that could be part of it. But that's just the act of singing a worship song doesn't mean you're worshiping. You can call it whatever you want. If you're not ascribing worth to God, then you're not worshiping. And most modern day worship songs are about the flesh. It's about me. It's not about God. So where's the worship of God there? But I bring this up because the idea when you see he leaned on his staff in worship, people are going to think, oh, you know, maybe he raised his hand or raised one hand or prayed to God. Or all it means is he's giving worth, ascribing worth to God. And by him giving the blessing to these 11 tribes of Israel in chapter 49, he is worshiping God. Because he's saying, God gave me these people, and God's given a specific blessing or a certain role for each of these tribes. And all I'm doing is by faith, I'm saying this is what each of the tribes will do in all eternity in the kingdom. And so he worshiped not by singing a worship chorus, not by lifting his hands. He leaned on the top of his staff and he spoke the words of Genesis 49, and that's how he worshiped. Look over in John chapter 4. Jesus makes this statement to the Samaritan woman. Verse 24. John 4:24. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. There's no mention of music here. He doesn't say worship him in spirit and the piano or the guitar or some good melody. He doesn't say that. He says spirit and in truth, which means biblical worship isn't me feeling the presence of God as I'm singing a worship song. Biblical worship is I'm ascribing worth to God. And the way I ascribe worth to God is I have faith in what he's told me in his word. His word is truth. So when I speak his word or speak the truth, I'm worshiping. I do it in the right spirit. In other words, I'm not doing it in the flesh. I have the idea of not what I can get out of it, but ascribing worth to God, and then I speak truth. That's worship. So really, we're worshiping God right now because we're reading the Scripture and we're believing it. And so that's what Jacob did. He leaned upon his staff, he spoke Genesis 49, and by speaking Genesis 49, he was worshiping God. So I brought all that out to show you that. You don't have to be in a church. You don't have to sing a so-called worship song. You worship God in spirit and in truth. In spirit meaning you're not in the flesh, seeing what you can get out of it or trying to feel good. In the spirit meaning you're allowing the Holy Spirit to work through your spirit to ascribe worth to God as you proclaim his truth. And that's how you do it. As you proclaim God's truth. And it shows that you have faith. Without faith it is impossible to please him. So you have faith in what God said. You speak the truth and you're worshiping God. You're ascribing worth to God because you're affirming what he said is the truth. You're affirming, yes, this is true. What God said is worthy to be learned by other people. It's worthy for me to believe and practice. So I'm ascribing worth to God. That's what Jacob does in Genesis 49. It's not some, because man has this different view of worship and it's the flesh, then the Septuagint comes along, changes it, changes Genesis 48:12 and makes you think it's based on that when it's not. Okay, going back to Hebrews 11. Verse 22 now. Now we go down to Joseph. Hebrews 11:22 says, by faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. I wrote on your outline that Joseph spoke prophetically of the burning bush. You got to remember there's at least a couple hundred years gap between Genesis and Exodus. the faith of Israel goes from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Joseph. And then you don't see anybody, I mean, Ephraim and Manasseh gets the blessing, but you don't really see anybody walking in faith of God until you get to Moses. The generations after Joseph, you're not told about their lives. You don't know what Ephraim and Manasseh did in their lives or what their children did. You got to go down to Moses. And so because there's this gap of unbelief in Egypt after Joseph, then what Joseph does then is when he died, he makes mention of the departing of the children of Israel. And so let's see where he does that, and gave commandment concerning his bones. So go over to Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50. Joseph here, end of his life. Look in verse 23. Genesis 50, verse 23. Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up upon Joseph's knees. You're not told about the lives of these people. They're just mentioned here. Now notice verse 24. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you, and bring you out of this land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died being 110 years old. These verses 24 and 25 are the verses where Joseph spoke at the end of his life. And he says it twice. God will surely visit you. Well, so then what do you have? You have a couple 100-year gap between Genesis and Exodus. You get to Exodus, you've got Moses, chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert, and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush, and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. Joseph said, God will surely visit you. He said that twice. He's going to bring him to the land of his fathers. And so then Moses gets visited by God right here in the burning bush. So that's why I wrote on your outline that Joseph spoke prophetically of the burning bush. Okay, so now let's go back to Hebrews 11. Keep your finger in Exodus, because we're going to go back there. But it shows that the way God basically bridged this 200-some-year gap between Joseph and Moses was by Joseph prophetically saying, God will surely visit you. So, wait, and they knew. Let's look at Genesis 15. They knew the time period. They knew when God would do it, because God told Abraham. In Genesis 15, God tells Abraham, verse 13, he said unto Abram, Genesis 15:13, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. So God gave a timeline to Abram. He says they're going to be in that land 400 years. So once Jacob comes into the land where Joseph is already there, and Jacob brings all the sons, and they come into the land to dwell, then we know from that point forward, it's going to be 400 years until God visits Israel. And time has passed during Joseph's time, so, maybe when Joseph dies, I don't know the chronology, I haven't studied it, but at least maybe 350 years are left by the time Joseph dies, let's say. And so he says, you're going to have to wait 350 years. That's a long time. The people who are alive at that time are not going to be alive. It's going to be several generations after, if it's going to be 350 years. So they have this promise that God will surely visit them. And then, when that time is up, you've got Moses. This is important about the timeline because evidently Moses' parents knew about this timeline and they knew it was about time for the deliverer, and apparently they saw something in the baby Moses that told them Moses is going to deliver you out of Egypt. And the way we know that is you go back, hold Exodus, but then look also in Hebrews 11, and now we're in verse 23. Verse 23 of Hebrews 11 gives you the faith of Moses' parents. It says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment." So according to this verse here, now a lot of times it's said, and this is what Christians believe, is that Moses' parents liked the baby. I mean, Pharaoh had given a command to kill all Hebrew males upon birth. Naturally, if you have a son born to you, you do not want to instantly kill your baby. You want your baby to grow up. So, I mean, there is that flesh thing, and that's what Christianity teaches, is they thought they didn't want to have to kill their son. That's a terrible thing. So they take Moses and they hide him. But that's not what it says. It doesn't say, I don't want to kill my son, it was just born to me. It doesn't say that. It says the reason that they hid him 3 months, it says because they saw he was a proper child. He's proper, he's fitting. In other words, they knew the timeline that God gave to Abram. And they recognized that it's about time for the deliverer to be born. It's very similar to the Lord Jesus Christ. And we'll go over that next. But, and so they don't spare him because they want to keep his son alive. They spare him because they recognize he's proper. He fits the criteria and the time to be the deliverer for Israel. And so they look and say, he's a type of the Messiah in that. And we'll see that later. But just like Jesus, when Jesus was born, Mary and Joseph, at the same time, Herod gives a commandment, 2 years afterward when the wise men come, Herod gives the commandment to kill all the boys 2 years and under. And God tells them to flee to Egypt so that Jesus isn't killed. They didn't bring Jesus to Egypt because that's Mary's son and they want him to, and they love him, although that's certainly part of it. The reason they did it is because he is the Messiah. God says he's the Messiah. He's the deliverer. So God says, protect this child. And that's the same thing with Moses' parents. Moses' parents look at him and they don't say, well, he's such a cute boy. He's my son. I want to protect him. Certainly they did. But it says because they saw he was a proper child. That's why they hid him. And then go over to Exodus 2. You can see this also in the story of his birth. Verse 1, Exodus 2, verse 1. And there went a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi. So basically these are Moses' parents. And it shows you that Moses is a Levite. Verse 2, and the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. So, again, Hebrews 11:23 says, Moses' parents saw he was a proper child. Exodus 2:2 says, she saw that he was a goodly child. So those two verses tell you that's why it's by faith. In other words, if Moses' parents just hid him because they didn't want their son to die, they're not doing it by faith. They're doing it for fleshly reasons. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you don't want your child to die, so you're hiding him. But the point of Exodus 2:2 and Hebrews 11:23 is that's not the reason that they hid him. The reason they hid him is they knew the timeline given to Abram. They knew it was about time. And they're looking for a deliverer. And so Moses comes along, and something about him, whatever it is, we're not told the details, but there is something about Moses. When he was born, they said, this is the deliverer. This is our Messiah. I'm certainly not the Christ. I mean, that's later. But this is our deliverer. He's going to deliver us out of Egypt. So we got to hide him. We got to protect him for him to be the deliverer. That's the idea there. And that, then, isn't a fleshly reason, but it's faith. Faith that God says, I'm going to deliver you. The Lord will surely visit you. And it's been 350 years since Joseph spoke that. And Israel is in apostasy. If you don't believe me, look at their journeyings in the 40 years in the wilderness. They're not believing. Moses' parents had faith in God's promise. And they said, here's the deliverer. We're going to make sure he doesn't die. Even though the king has commanded him to be killed, we're going to risk our lives so that he may live. So Moses' parents saw that God could have used Moses to be Israel's deliverer. And then to see the parallel, look over in Luke chapter 2. Because Israel in Jesus' day, they were given the timeline of Daniel chapter 9, the 70 weeks of Daniel. After the 69th week, Messiah is going to be cut off. And so the people who believed that knew that the Messiah should be born any day now, when you're in Luke chapter 2. And they knew that he would have to come to Jerusalem, where the temple is, to be circumcised, for the person to have the firstborn purification rites for the woman, then the firstborn son, from having a child, and then the firstborn son, the sacrifice, the circumcision involved with that. So they knew they'd have to come to Jerusalem. So they're waiting in Jerusalem for the Messiah. Look in Luke chapter 2. In Luke chapter 2, Jesus presented in the temple. Verse 36, there's one Anna, a prophetess. She was a widow, verse 37, of about 84 years, which departed not from the temple, but served God with fastings and prayers night and day. She's there because she recognizes the Messiah's got to come any day now. We're in Daniel's timeline, we're about 33 years away from Messiah being cut off. Well, before he can be cut off, he's got to be born. And he should have been born by now, she's thinking. So she's there with fasting and prayers, waiting night and day for the Messiah. And so he shows up. And look at what it says in verse 38. And she coming in that instant gave thanks likewise unto the Lord, and spake of him to all them that looked for redemption in Jerusalem. Knowing the prophetic timeline, there is a group of believers in Israel, and they're waiting. They're saying, 33 years until Messiah is going to be cut off. He's got to be born any day now. We're staying in this temple. And Anna says, I'm staying here. I want to see my deliverer. I'm staying here night and day. I'm praying for God to come. And so she's the first one who sees him. Simeon is before that, verse 34. He blesses them in verse 34. Then Anna, and she sees him. And then she goes and tells everybody else who is waiting, he's here, come see him. There's that believing remnant. That's the same thing that's going on in the day of Moses' parents. They recognize the timeline given to Abraham. They know the deliverer is going to be born soon. And they give birth to Moses, and they say, this is him. He's a proper child. He's a goodly child. This is our deliverer. I'm not going to let Pharaoh... And why do you think Pharaoh commanded to have these kids killed anyway? Satan attacking the seed. Recognize Satan knew God's promise too. And Satan says, well, God can't bring a deliverer to bring Israel out of Egypt if I kill all the boys. Because there's not going to be a deliverer. So I'll have all the Hebrew boys killed when they're born. No Hebrew boys, no deliverer, God loses. I win. That's Satan's idea. So Satan has Pharaoh kill the boys. And Moses' parents have faith in God's promise. So they know there's going to be a deliverer. So they say, here he is. I know the commandment given. I'm going to hide him. And we'll let God, we'll hide him as best we can, but then it's up to God. And God saves and protects him. And so Moses' parents, the point of this is Moses' parents had a great deal of faith. The next thing here in chapter Hebrews 11, now verse 24, now we're going to see the faith of Moses. Verse 24, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Then verse 28 says, through faith he kept the Passover. So we know that verses 24 through 27 happen before the 10 plagues, because verse 28 is when he keeps the Passover, and the Passover is the 10th plague. So verses 24 through 27 is talking about Moses' life before that time. Interestingly enough, what it's really talking about is the time when he is 40 years old. When Moses is 40 years old, go over to Exodus chapter 2. Hold Hebrews 11 and look at Exodus 2. Again, the eyes of man looking at Moses would not look at this as faith. But the eyes of God says this is faith. Which is why we need to compare the two and get a different perspective. Get God's perspective, not our perspective. So Exodus 2, we read about Moses' birth. Now verse 10. Exodus 2 verse 10. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, because I drew him out of the water. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown. Okay, so now he's an adult. He was a child before, now he's an adult. What did Hebrews 11:24 say? By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So that's the same thing as what we see in Exodus 2:11. It came to pass in those days when Moses was grown. He came to years. He was grown. He's an adult now. He has the ability to make the decision for himself. And this happens to be around age 40. So Exodus 2:11 says, it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way. And when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to him that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So basically what happens here is around the age 40, Moses decides, I'm forsaking Egypt. Which was a big thing, because he's the son of Pharaoh's daughter, according to Exodus 2:10, which means he's gotten all the Egyptian training, he's got the wealth. You know, he's the Pharaoh's grandson. If you're the Pharaoh's grandson and the Pharaoh has all this wealth, then you have all that wealth too. You're in the line. You get it automatically. You don't do anything, you get it. You get all the good training. You're an Egyptian through and through. But then, at age 40, he says, now wait a minute here. God has chosen me to be the deliverer of Israel. And so I've got all these riches. I've got all the pleasures of sin for a season here that I can enjoy in Egypt, enjoy the good life, not have any persecution, no heartache. I could have all these concubines and houses, and I would be the king eventually. I'm the grandson, probably going to be the king. All these things, riches and everything, he could be the Pharaoh there. But he says, no, I'm having faith in God's promise. And God wants me to be the deliverer. He hasn't shown up in the burning bush yet. That's the next chapter. But he knows what his parents did. How did this come about? Well, the Pharaoh's daughter says, well, I found you. This is your heritage. I found you in the bulrushes, and I took you as my own. And he finds out, I'm sure, he's asking around, figures it out, finds out that his parents had faith in what God had told them. And so Moses says, at age 40, he says, I'm forsaking Egypt. God has chosen me to be the deliverer of Israel, so I'm going to do it. So he goes out there, and he says, he sees this Egyptian smiting a Hebrew. Well, God wants me to be the deliverer. Here's a Hebrew being oppressed by an Egyptian. I kill the Egyptian. That's faith in God's promise. Now, every commentary and every Christian that you ever hear is going to tell you, well, this Moses, he got ahead of God. You know, God's will, we want to do God's will, but God has perfect timing for everything. And it just wasn't God's timing. And God's timing was 40 years later. So what Moses did was he killed this Egyptian. The Hebrews got mad about it. And so because he got ahead of God, he suffered for 40 years as in Midian as a Midianite. And then he had to wait until age 80. That was God's timing. So then at age 80, he comes back. You got the burning bush, and he becomes the deliverer. He was just ahead of God. He wasn't doing it in God's timing. That's what people will say. That's what every commentary, what every preacher is going to say. But now go back to Hebrews 11, because Hebrews 11 does not say that. Hebrews 11 verse 24. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, that's Exodus 2:11, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That's when he left. He went over, he saw the Egyptian smiting the Hebrew, and he killed the Egyptian. That's at that time. It's not 40 years later. It's at that time, when he come to years. Or else, if it's talking about age 80, it would say, by faith Moses, after he came to years and lived in Midian for 40 years, then served the Lord and God used him. It doesn't say that. It says when he was come to years, at that time, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He says, I'm God's deliverer. I'm going out there to deliver. And so when he smote the Egyptian, he knew exactly what he was doing. You see there in Exodus 2:12, when he's about to do it, it says he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He knew he's in big trouble. He's making the choice not to be aligned with Pharaoh, but to be aligned with the Hebrews. Now the Hebrews are slaves to the Egyptians. If you kill, it's just like in our history in America, blacks and whites. The blacks were the slaves. If the whites persecuted the blacks, no one cared about that. But if a black person rose up and killed the white person, you better believe that black person was going to die. And all his family is probably going to die too. I mean, there were dire consequences. That's what you've got here. The Hebrews are slaves to the Egyptians. And here's Moses, and he comes and he kills an Egyptian. So he knows if he does this, he's now on the Hebrew side, especially since he is a Hebrew. He is on the Hebrew side, and basically they're going to try to kill him. So he looks this way, but he knows that's going to happen, and yet he does it anyway. He looks this way and that way, not because he's afraid, but it's just he wants to make sure he can do it. If someone's around, they can kill him before he gets to kill the Egyptian. So he makes sure no one's around, then he kills the Egyptian. And so when he does this, then you notice in verse 13, you've got the Hebrews, verse 14. So Moses kills this Egyptian, protecting the Hebrews. So you think the Hebrews would be glad about it, but the thing is, the Hebrews are in total unbelief. You see them in the wilderness, 40 years of unbelief. They don't believe God. They don't believe him here. So Moses, I'm the deliverer. He comes in, kills the Egyptian, and the Hebrews, they get mad at Moses. You'd think they'd say, well, thanks, Moses, for sticking up for us. You're about to be killed yourself, so it probably wasn't a wise thing to do, but thank you for sticking up for us. You'd think that's what they'd say, but look at what they say in verse 14. Exodus 2:14. Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Well, the answer to that is God did. God says he's the deliverer. But Hebrews, being in unbelief, being in apostasy, says, that timeline gave to Abraham? We don't believe that stuff. You're crazy. God's not delivering us. So they say, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? And so he says this thing is known. So he finds out verse 15, Pharaoh's trying to slay him. So then he goes to Midian and he lives there. He has He has a wife there, and he lives there for 40 years in Midian. Okay, so now, go back to Hebrews 11. So by faith Moses, when he was come to years, this is verse 24, refused to